Hi guys, this is Weasel. Welcome to the first video in the Microstakes Weasel strategy series. I just wanted to start off by introducing myself. My name is Adam. I'm 24 years old from the UK and I have two jobs. I play poker semi-professionally and I'm also a musician. I do some teaching and also some gigs. I'm quite excited to be coaching for iPoker VIP. Some of the first strategy articles, the written articles, are out already. There is one called Microstakes Myth, which is discussing some of the effects of variance on microstakes games. And the other articles which are coming soon, I've tried to make as relevant as possible to starting out at the microstakes and the most relevant concepts you need to begin with. I wanted to start playing at 4NL because not too many coaches like to start at this stake. A lot of training videos will begin from 10NL onwards, and I just wanted to start down here. Perhaps it's more relevant to your own stakes, perhaps you're playing these stakes yourself. Although there shouldn't be too much difference between this stake and a slightly higher stake, for example 25NL. But hopefully we should move up pretty quickly after we've had a couple of videos at these stakes. So first of all, on table 2 with the Queen 3 offsuit, this isn't a standard play for me necessarily. I just saw that this guy has a high attempt to steal so far, and I think this is probably going to be profitable in a vacuum. I just wanted to see how I thought he was going to respond to 3 bets. It's probably better that you wait for a slightly better hand, perhaps a suited queen. But hopefully this will be profitable on fold equity alone. And if it's not, then we should perhaps get a read if he flats our 3-bet out of position or he does something similar. We should perhaps get some information also. I do generally like to play quite a loose aggressive style, and it does involve some post-flop hand reading skills. And while it's not necessarily recommended you play quite as loose as I play on occasions, I will hopefully manage to elaborate on my thought processes so you can see why I'm making certain plays. Table 4, we flat the pocket 4s after under the gun open raises, which is pretty standard. It gets checks through to us, and the board comes a king high drive board, and I do expect under the gun to c-bet a lot of the time when he has a king x. When he checks to us, I think it's much more likely the player in the big blind has a king x type hand than the player under the gun, because I think under the gun is going to be c-betting a lot of his king x's, especially in a 3-way pot. There's no real reason for him to not c-bet a king here, so I decided to take a stab at the flop. I think I should have a reasonable amount of fold equity on this board, which is king high, semi-dry with a flush draw. When under the gun does check call, I think his range likely either consists of things like flush draws, which he wanted to check call, although he could still c-bet these, or hands like pocket tens, pocket jacks, pocket queens, hands that have showdown value but probably can't stand up to multiple barrels. It's definitely fine to give up here. I also think it's an okay spot to barrel. Sometimes it might be a little better with a hand that has more equity in this spot than pocket 4s, perhaps something like ace jack of diamonds perhaps. But I definitely think in this case that we may be able to fold this player off a hand like pocket jacks or pocket queens. Obviously when we hit the 4 on the river, it's a great card for us. If he is taking some weird line with a king, hopefully we can get some value. If he does have a hand like pocket jacks and pocket queens that he did want to check call twice, then hopefully we can get some value against these also. Also in his range he has busted diamond draws, which he is obviously going to be check folding. We definitely want to value bet the river, given that we have hit a set, but we are also aware of the fact that villain's strongest hand a lot of the time is going to be a one pair hand, sometimes even not top pair. Therefore, we don't want to value bet huge. I make it $1.72. We could even decide to bet smaller to perhaps make sure he definitely calls with pocket jacks. I also figured that betting slightly larger as well, perhaps I can represent something like a busted draw myself, and therefore perhaps he's more likely to bluff catch with a hand like pocket jacks if he's even thinking on that level, which is my reasoning for making a slightly larger value bet. But given that we expect his range to have a lot of things like pocket jacks, you could definitely bet a lot smaller on that river for value. Table 4, we open raise the ace-10 offsuit from under the gun. It's actually a pretty borderline open, it's definitely fine, but when we have a hand like ace-9 offsuit from under the gun, we can definitely think about folding. Table 1, we make a standard open raise with the pocket queens from under the gun. I do end up playing quite loose in this video, as it turns out. It does seem that there are a lot of type players on the tables I have selected. I will perhaps tighten up in some later videos. I just wanted to introduce a few different aspects of my game. Table 2 with the a7 offsuit. We could definitely think about 3-bet bluffing here, just because it's a kind of spot where we wouldn't normally be expected to have a bluff when we 3-bet with the cutoff against middle position. And this is something that I will discuss on the theory video on 3-bet bluffing and the implications of your hand strength depending on the positions involved. For example, if we are to 3-bet bluff from the cutoff versus an MP open, it looks a lot stronger than if we were to bluff from the blinds against a button open or from the button against a cutoff open. Table 4, it's a pretty marginal open, especially given that the small blind is short stacked and has less than 25 big blinds. However, both blinds do seem tight, and while I'm obviously not thrilled about my hand, hopefully it should be profitable on fold equity alone. We do end up getting 3-bet pretty small, and given the odds I'm getting to call, if I had anything even remotely playable, I'd probably be flatting in position. I think perhaps the 8-6 offsuit is not the greatest hand to be calling there with. However, given the price we get, given that we have position, it probably wouldn't be too terrible to make the call. Probably best off folding until we have something slightly stronger, however. Table 2, we open raise the pocket sixes from under the gun. And we do get shoved on by this short stack in the small blind. And given the fact that we have this player in the cutoff to act behind us, unfortunately we have to fold. If we didn't have this player behind us, we could perhaps consider calling with pocket sixes. But given that this player behind us could call, or perhaps he could even reshove, we should definitely be folding the pocket sixes. Table 4, we make a pretty standard call with pocket twos against an under the gun open. Under the gun open so far seems like he might be a regular, given his stats. He does c-bet this ace-jack 6 board, and sometimes you could consider floating here, but it would be better on an ace-high dry board where there were no perhaps Broadway draws or flush draws, Also, a hand like pocket twos doesn't typically have that much equity. He always will have two overcards to our pocket pair, and some of the time we'll be in bad shape when he does have a pair, but a lot of the time we perhaps can take the pot down on the turn. Table 3, we open raise the 7 deuce off from the button. The reason is I think it will be profitable on fold equity alone. A lot of the time against certain blinds you can in fact open any two cards from the button. That doesn't mean you have to open trash hands like this. You can of course fold them. It does seem from stats that this player in the big blind is playing quite loose, in which case we wouldn't normally want to open these hands, especially when we think it's likely we are going to get called. However, this player in the big blind is a known regular just from the times I have played on iPoker before, and I don't think he is anywhere near as loose as his stats suggest. And therefore I think we probably have a profitable steal, perhaps with any two cards. Table 2 we complete in the small blind, mainly because the player who is in middle position is likely a fish, and hopefully we have good implied odds, even out of position. Table 3 we flat with the pocket queens, because I think 3-betting might look quite strong from this position. Table 2 we do turn trips, and I don't see much benefit to donking here. I'm not sure how many worse hands can call. Perhaps some draws can call, but I think there is perhaps more value in letting one of these two players semi-bluff with one of their draws, which also may call a bet, but I do think by checking and calling a bet, we also allow them to perhaps take a stab at this board with air. Table 1, we open raise and we flop top pair and a backdoor draw and a gut shot. Against the short stack on the button, we are just going to bet the flop and shove the turn for value. Table 3, you could definitely consider raising here. The board is quite drawy. The downside to raising is you will get a lot of folds, and some of the time you may isolate yourself against a range which isn't that great for you. The advantage to flatting is it allows him to barrel with some of his semi-bluffs, with some of his pure bluffs, perhaps things like overcards. The downside is of course you let him see draws quite cheaply. I did decide to flat, and I do hit a set on the turn, top set. The only hand that I'm really worried about is of course something like 9-10, which you can have, but quite rarely. And of course, at this point, I think iPoker decides to freeze up for about 2 minutes. And notice this happens when I have almost the nuts on 3 different tables. But fortunately the action does resume, and I am going to skip the video forward 2 minutes to when the action resumes. And on table 3, villain does c-bet, and I decide to raise. I think with this turn card hitting, he perhaps has some more strong made hands he can continue with. And also my hand strength is a lot higher, therefore I'm not really isolating myself against a range I don't do so well against anymore. And you could definitely raise the flop on that queen's hand. In fact, if I was playing a small stakes game, I would almost definitely raise the flop, just because there's so many draws that villain may continue with. As we will go on to see, flop raises at the micros typically are quite strong, and therefore You may even end up over-repping your hand. Not necessarily with a hand like pocket queens, but you will end up at the bottom of your range because your flop raising range also includes things like sets, and in terms of getting value, it's always best to be at the top of your range. And we will go on to see another example a bit later in the session regarding a flop check raise. Table 2, this is a great spot to 3-bet light, button versus cutoff. We don't actually have any reads on the cutoff, but we do have a hand with some potential, a suited king, so we are just going to 3-bet as a bluff. And if we are called, we may sometimes be able to make some hands or take the pot down in position. Table 4, again this player does 3-bet us and he makes it the same size as he made it before. And again I do consider calling just because we are getting a great price, but again I just decide that there are even slightly better hands that I should wait for than 5-4 offsuit. But I am intending to play back against his small 3-bet at some point. Table 2, we flat the king-queen offsuit in the small blind. I don't want to 3-bet for value because I do not know how the button is responding. I'd rather 3-bet bluff until I know how someone is going to respond than 3-bet for value. So I typically flat some value hands in the blinds against button opens, especially if I don't know how they will respond. We check call the flop because we flop top pair. I don't think there's any point in raising the flop. We also have a backdoor spade draw, and we have a gut shot. The turn gives us our flush draw with the queen high, and we also have a draw to a higher straight because the jack gives us a king high straight if this button player does in fact have a jack for the straight, so he can get counterfeited. Also our queen high draw may be good, so we do decide to also check call the turn. When we don't improve on the river, I think it's a pretty easy check fold. Table 4, we open raise the ace-8 suited from middle position because one of the players is sitting out. You can open suited aces from anywhere on the table. Until you have developed strong hand reading skills, you may find it useful to only open suited aces from the button and the cutoff. It also depends on who is at your table and how tough opponents they are, and you may decide to fold such hands under the gun if you are in a particularly tough game. Table 4, we do consider 3-betting as a bluff. I decide to wait for something a little bit stronger. I'm not sure if this player is going to be calling 3-bets out of position, but it would have been a fine spot to 3-bet bluff. As you will go on to see in the strategy video dealing with 3-bet bluffs, they do not need to be profitable, or they do not need to work that often in order to be profitable. So you can often 3-bet quite wide against players that are folding a lot to 3-bets, especially small blind versus big blind. Table 2, we open raise the pocket 8s. The flop isn't good for us. I don't think he's folding any better hands, and I don't think he's necessarily calling with worse. Sometimes you may call with a hand like Jack King, but it still has a huge amount of equity against us with 2 overcards and an open-ender. I just decide to check back the 8s, sometimes with the intention of calling off maybe some bluffs, although when the board gets worse I decide to just fold to villain's turn bet. Perhaps some of the time villain tries to show down a hand like pocket 6s and we win with our 8s at showdown, but we don't necessarily gain anything by c-betting pocket 8s and villain folding pocket 6s since we beat that hand anyway. Table 2, again we have trash, or queen high at least, but assuming this player is folding to 3-bets, and he did fold to the last 3-bet, this play should be profitable on fold equity alone. Table 2, we pick up the pocket jacks. And it's folded round to us. This player in the big blind so far is playing 11-8. Ironically, if he does call, we perhaps may not even be extremely happy about our hand. But this is the kind of player where we can just relentlessly try and steal his big blinds. He is folding so much to open raises that we can realistically open any two cards in the small blind just because the player is so tight. Table 3, we're just going to fold the Jack Queen offsuit against an under the gun open. Also under the gun is short stacked, and also he is playing quite tight, so it's a pretty standard fold. Table 4, we do open raise the King 5 suited. It's definitely not a standard raise from middle position. However, the cutoff is yet to play a hand, and both blinds are very tight. The only player that has really been active is this player on the button, who is playing 23-23 so far, over 55 hands. However, I don't expect this player is going to be 3-betting against my middle position open as often. Therefore, I'm pretty much just hoping to steal the blinds from middle position. We do get called by this reasonably tight big blind, and the flop is ace queen 6. Again, we could consider floating on this board. This player has not donk bet yet. However, some players will do this, perhaps to induce. Given that he hasn't donk bet before, it increases the likelihood that he is doing it with a strong made hand, perhaps in the hope of inducing a raise on my part. I just decide to let the King 5 go. Table 2, we have the 10-4 suited. If it's folded round to us, I'm definitely going to be opening this hand just because the big blind is so tight. And I'm literally just going to be opening any two until he starts to adjust. But I do not think that is going to be happening anytime soon. Table 2 with the 8-5 suited. Again, both blinds are tight, so we can definitely open raise this hand, and I do decide to 3-bet as a bluff on table 1 versus the small blind open. Given that the small blind only opens to 2.5x, we could even just about consider calling with our ace x offsuit in position. It is just about going to be profitable. However, it is borderline, and 3-betting as a bluff is going to be fine, especially seeing as the open raiser has a high steal attempt so far. Table 1, again we have another player in the big blind who so far is playing very tight. Maybe that he is card dead, but we should steal his blinds if we get the opportunity. Table 4, we open raise the ace 5 suited. It's a pretty standard open raise. Table 2, we turn an open ender and we call a small bet on the turn. The river comes a 10, and the question is whether we should bluff here or not. And I decided I don't think he's folding a hand like any pocket pair enough. Perhaps you have heard of Zebo's theorem, which basically says no one ever folds a full house. I decided this player is never folding a hand like pocket 5s, and it's debatable whether I can even fold him off ace high on such a board when there's 3 10s out there. I decided to just check my 8 high down and lose the pot. Table 2, we open raise a 7-6 suited. It's usually a pretty standard open raise from the cutoff. Table 4, we open raise from MP and we get 3-bet by the player in the cutoff. As I was saying, this is typically representative of strength, and I'm just going to fold my hand. It's a lot less likely this player is going to be bluffing from these specific positions, so I have no problem just folding to his 3-bet. Table 4, you could consider open raising the Queen 10 suited just because the table is so tight. Otherwise, you should really be folding this hand under the gun. The problem with a hand like Queen 10 is it does have some domination issues. In fact, it's often better to open raise a hand like 8-9 suited from under the gun than it is to open raise something that makes weak top pairs a high proportion of the time, something like Queen Jack. If it's suited, it's obviously slightly better to open raise from under the gun because it also has potential to make things like straights and flushes. But if it's just a hand like Queen Jack offsuit, King 10 offsuit, Queen 10 offsuit, you should almost always be folding these hands from under the gun, unless you have a very specific reason for opening it. Perhaps there might be a huge fish in the blinds, or perhaps the table is just so tight that you think you are going to steal a whole ton of the time. But in general, you should be folding hands that have domination issues from under the gun. Table 2, again, if it's folded round to us, we are just going to open raise the 8-4 offsuit. It does not matter the strength of our hand. And we are going to be open raising the 5-4 suited if it folded round to us. And table 4, again, we get another excellent opportunity to 3-bet as a bluff. The player in the cutoff has been folding a lot, 100% to 3-bet so far, over a small sample size. This is definitely a good spot to 3-bet. A hand that's not quite strong enough to flatten in position, but is still going to play reasonably well and has some potential. Table 2, we open raise the Ace-King offsuit, which is a standard open raise from anywhere on the table. And the flop is Ace-2-3, so we flop top pair, top kicker. And we are going to c-bet for value, to get value from worse aces, to get value from flush draws, perhaps some gut shots. And he does decide to check raise. And honestly, in this spot at the micros, I really don't mind if you just want to fold this hand. Perhaps at a slightly higher stakes where you can expect this player to be check raise bluffing a much higher frequency, calling is going to be a good option because this player perhaps expects you to fold anything that's not an ace. At the micro stakes, people's flop raising frequency, especially check raises, so out of position flop raises, is typically very, very value heavy. I expect this player to have a hand like Ace-2 suited, Ace-3 suited, pocket 2s, pocket 3s, a large proportion of the time. Perhaps some of the time he can be perhaps taking a line where he check raises something like Ace-Queen for value when he sees that there's a flush draw out there. However, a flush draw is not a very big part of my range, and as such, he may even be flatting a hand like Ace-Queen, Ace-Jack. So if he's check calling a hand like Ace-Queen or Ace-Jack or Ace-10, and he is not check raise bluffing here very often, then his range for check raising this flop is pretty much going to be 2-pair or better. It may turn out that I'm wrong about this guy, and perhaps he just loves to check raise flops all day, in which case I will soon pick up on that, and if I knew he is check raise bluffing flops with a very high frequency, I would call here, because that way I keep in the bluff part of his range. By 3-betting here, I fold out the bluff part of his range, and I isolate myself against the value part of his range, which I possibly don't do so well against, unless he's capable of check raising more hands like Ace-Queen or Ace-10 for value. But Even then, he may not be raising those hands for value, he may just be flatting those hands, in which case his value range has a hand like ace-king in pretty bad shape. As I say, it may turn out I'm wrong about him, but the average player at the Microstakes is going to be very value heavy when he makes his check raise. This player is an unknown to me at the moment, relatively unknown. The only information I have on him is that he is quite tight, which again means he is less likely to be check raising as a bluff. But given that I do not know anything about his flop check raising frequencies as of yet, he hasn't had an opportunity to check raise a flop, it makes sense to assume that his flop check raising range is value heavy, just like 80% of the players at the Microstakes, or perhaps more, their flop check raise range is also value heavy. So in this particular spot, we've got two options. We can either call down. There's never much point in raising here, because it's likely he's going to continue barreling a hand like ace queen, ace jack, ace 10 anyway. If he thinks it's good enough for a flop raise, a flop check raise, he's probably going to be betting the turn with it. But for the aforementioned reasons, I honestly think folding in this spot is fine. Perhaps if you are playing at slightly higher stakes, when you know that people's check raising frequencies on average contain a higher amount of check raise bluffs, then you can start calling down in this spot. But at the micros, I think this is a pretty solid spot to find folds. And that doesn't just apply to these type of boards, it can also apply to a board, say, like Queen 2-3, where you have pocket kings. And these are typically very good spots to find folds at the micros, unless you have a very specific read on villain that he likes to check raise bluff. And this goes back to the pocket queens hand I was talking about before. The EV of even slow playing certain hands on boards where you would typically raise because there are draws, the EV of slow playing goes up slightly just because raising in general looks so strong at the micros, and so therefore you might flat in some spots where you would typically raise for value and for protection against draws, which was the reasoning behind that pocket queens hand I played earlier, the reason why I didn't raise the flop. Table 1, we just took the pot down against an MP open where we 3-bet bluff Jack 9 suited on the button against the player who has 80% fold to 3-bet so far. I do suspect he is a regular, and therefore he may even give me more credit for 3-betting against his middle position open, because he can interpret that as being stronger. Table 1, this is definitely not a standard open raise for me with a 9-7 offsuit. It's just that the entire table is so tight. The cutoff is playing 6-6 over 34 hands. The button is playing 10-7 over 105 hands. It's very rare I raise a hand like 9-7 offsuit from middle position, but given how tight the table is, I think it's going to be profitable. The flop is somewhat close. It depends what level this player is thinking on. I decide to c-bet and just hope that he is folding anything that hasn't connected with that board. There are some draws out there, but perhaps he just folds a hand like 9-10, or maybe even something like ace-queen. Whereas some type of players may decide to check call a hand like ace-queen if they consider the fact that I may not have hit that board too often either. But hopefully is the type of player that folds to c-bets, and we do take it down that time. Table 1, we get 3-bet to this awkward size that this player, who is on at least 2 of our tables, has been making this size. And given the positions involved, he is 3-betting from the small blind against an under the gun open. I think this is pretty much never a bluff, and I don't think he's raising a worse hand for value. We are of course getting a good price, but the problem is we have some reverse implied odds. For example, in the case of him having ace queen or ace king and we have king queen and we both flop top pair and I'm out kicked. So despite the fact we're getting a great price pre-flop, we sometimes end up in spots post-flop where we can't really fold, but we're just doomed to end up losing more money. Table 4, I did say I was not going to let this guy continue making these 3-bet sizes, and given the price I'm getting, I decide to flat in position with the intention of floating some flops, maybe bluff raising some flops. Given that I have a pair, I'm just going to float because I have 5 outs. I possibly have the best hand, and I may have a good shot at taking it down on the turn also. Given that I turn 2 pair, I'm just going to bet for value. And in actual fact, if I had stopped to calculate the stack sizes, I probably would have made it a little bit smaller, just to set up a nice river shove. But the plan is pretty much to shove rivers for value and hope to get called by perhaps a king X. Table 1 with a 6-4 offsuit. If it's folded round to me, I'm definitely opening, since I pretty much have 2 of the tightest blinds in the world. Table 2, I get called by this player who is very tight, and when you get called by someone who is tight, you should proceed with caution post-flop. I decide not to c-bet this board because, again, I don't think he's folding a better hand, and I don't think I'm getting called by worse very often. And if he does call with worse, it's something that has a large amount of equity against me, so I hope to check it down. Table 3, you could consider opening this hand from the cutoff. The problem is there are 2 short stacked players yet to act behind me, one of which, the big blind, has 3-bet at least once and could even 3-bet me in this situation. I don't like to play on tables which have 2 or more short stackers. I would much rather play on a table with full stacks. And the reason is you can get away with opening a lot wider when you're playing against players with deep stacks, because there is still going to be a lot of play in it post flop. You can make certain plays that you can't make against someone who is short stacked, and therefore if you have short stack players in position on you or even at your table, a lot of the time you have to tighten up your opening range, because if they start re-raising you or 3-betting you, it's very difficult to play back when they have such shallow stacks. Therefore, typically I will be looking to replace this table 3 as soon as I can find a better table in the lobby. Table 4, I'm getting a great price with the 9-6, but I also have good implied odds, but I decide to fold just because it's a trash hand, more or less. It does seem I would have flopped the second nuts, but when you do see someone that's playing 11-8 and is obviously open raising very tight, you can sometimes begin to call with more speculative hands because they become profitable just due to the fact that you have good implied odds. If the original open raiser is so tight, and perhaps they have something like aces, it's going to be very difficult for them to get away from that hand post flop when you make something like 2 pair or better. Whereas if they're opening very wide, then even if you do make a hand, you might not get paid off. And the same principle applies when you're set mining. Sometimes if someone is opening very wide, it's not going to be profitable to set mine because they are likely just not going to pay you off when you do hit your set. Table 1, easy open raise with the king 5 suited. The big blind is playing super tight, 7-7 over 43 hands. We are definitely just going to be open raising any two. Table 1 with the king deuce suited. If we get the chance, we will definitely be open raising this. Since the big blind is tight as well, I'm pretty convinced it's going to be profitable on table 1 to just open raise any button. These players are just folding enough for it to be profitable, even if we never see bet post flop. And it's not going to be as if we never see bet post flop anyway, because when we do make a hand 2 pair or better, we are obviously going to be c betting, so we can make money here as well. In this particular case, we do get 3 bet, and the big blind has played 131 hands and he hasn't 3 bet yet. It's pretty clear that he has a strong hand and is not bluffing. I'm almost certain he has a hand like pocket queens plus, maybe ace king, so it's an easy fold with the king deuce suited. Open raise the king jack from cutoff. It's fairly standard open, especially with such tight players behind us. And I'm probably just going to be folding the king 6. And you could consider completing with the 6-7 here, but it's by no means a necessary call. If our hand wasn't quite as good on this 5-6-8 board with a pair and open ender, I would almost definitely donk here, because if either of these players don't like the board, then they are probably going to be folding a high percentage of the time. Given the fact that my hand is quite good in this spot with an open ender and a pair, I decide my hand is actually strong enough to check call. And the turn comes as 7, which obviously increases our absolute hand strength in that we now have 2 pairs instead of 1 pair, but it's not really a good card for us, seeing as now any 9 or any 4 gives either of these players a straight. I don't think the player in the cutoff ever has a 9 when he flats here. I think he's raising a 9 a lot of the time, although not necessarily. People do like to slow play at the micros. I think if he does have a straight, it's more likely he has a 4. But there are also 2 pair combos that beat ours, like any 8-6, 8-7 or 8-5. We have to call on the turn because we have 2 pair, we have outs to a boat, and we may potentially have very good implied odds. If someone does have a 9 or even a 4, we may make some more money on the river. So we can't really fold the turn to such a small bet in a multi-way pot. But when this guy bets the river, I just don't think our hand is good enough of the time to make the call. I think it's quite likely he has a 4, or maybe some of the time a better 2 pair. I think he's probably betting bigger on the river with a 9. I think he's possibly raising the turn with a 9. So I think his most likely hands are a 4, or perhaps some 2 pair that beats ours. Maybe once in a while a 2 pair that we beat, but not often enough of the time, in my opinion, to make a profitable river call. Table 1, again I complete in the small blind. It's something that a lot of players won't do, complete in the small blind, and that's fine if you don't like to complete in the small blind. Some players are convinced it is not profitable. I, however, think that people are just going to be making such huge mistakes post-flop that it's probably going to be profitable, just on the fact that you are getting good implied odds. When you do make a strong hand, then you are going to get paid off a lot more often against bad players. So table 1 with the ace-5 offsuit. Again, we are open raising this if it's folded round to us. And table 3, he's stolen 1 out of 2 attempts from the button. I'm not sure how he's going to respond to 3-bets yet, but there's a good way to find out, and so I 3-bet the king 7 suited as a bluff. As you will go on to see if you watch the video on 3-bet bluffing, there is really no need to c-bet any flop if you are not comfortable with how villain is going to respond. However, I don't think he's hit that flop this often. I think this is actually a pretty good board to c-bet. And I don't want to bet too big because I think if I bet smaller, 1, it's cheaper, and 2, perhaps I represent a stronger hand better this way. Because if it looks like he kind of hit that board too well and I have a hand like pocket aces that wants to get value, am I really going to bet pot size? I think in his mind it's more likely I'm going to bet a slightly smaller amount to try and induce him to call with a slightly wider range to help me get value. So I think there's no need to bet too big on the flop. Table 4, I open raise the queen deuce suited. I'm not convinced this is a profitable open raise. I wasn't sure how the big blind exactly is going to be responding. I think it's quite likely the big blind is a fish who likes to call too much, in which case it's probably not going to be that good of an idea to open a hand like queen deuce suited, especially given his stack size. If he had a full stack, it might be fine to open queen deuce suited, because if he's a calling station and you have a hand that can make things like queen high flushes, then you have good implied odds when this player pays you off. But when he is only half stacked, this obviously means your implied odds suffer, because when you do make a strong hand, there is just not as much money to be made. So it's probably a good idea to have been folding the queen deuce suited. Table 4, I open raise the king 7, and this player in the big blind, who has been giving me some trouble so far, he's the player that's been making these weird size 3-bets, and he does in fact squeeze, and I do decide to put in a 4-bet bluff, and part of the reason is I think it perhaps carries more leverage, just given the fact that this fish is in the pot, because perhaps this player in the big blind, if he is a regular, will possibly think that I'm not going to 4-bet bluff him there, just because the fish is still to act, so it makes it less likely I'm 4-bet bluffing, and if he doesn't have a hand, he is going to fold. Your 4-bet bluff sizing should be somewhere between about 2.2x maybe and 2.5x. A good guide is to put in 25% of the effective stack sizes with your 4-bet bluff. So I make it 128, which is fine. And given that he has a high fold to 3-bet, I hope to take the pot down reasonably often. Although this might not necessarily be the case, because most of this 14.3% 3-bet has come from those weird size 3-bets, whereas this 3-bet was actually bigger than the others. It may have been bigger just because he was squeezing and there is more money in the pot, so he wants to raise to a larger size to mean his play works more often if it's a bluff, but it may also mean that when he raises to that small size that he's bluffing, and when he raises a lot bigger that he has a hand like pocket aces, so maybe it's not the best spot to 4-bet bluff. But in general, this is a good spot to 4-bet bluff. Someone has been 3-betting wide, and it's a standard spot for them to 3-bet wide, the big blind versus the button. So it's a good idea to throw in a reasonable amount of light 4-bets in this particular spot. In this case, he does decide to jam over the top. It's quite likely he just had a hand like Queen's Plus or Ace King. Perhaps if he's a good player, he has a bluff there, and if he has a bluff, well played. Or perhaps he's just on tilt. It's quite rare players will 5-bet jam as a bluff at the micros, and part of the reason is simply that players are not 4-betting frequently enough. This player has got no reason to suspect that I'm 4-betting light or as a bluff necessarily. It's reasonable for him to assume that my 4-bet is quite value heavy, as is most players' 4-bets on the microstakes. So therefore, when he does decide to jam over the top, I think it's quite likely he does have a value hand. As to how wide he's value jamming, that might be a different question entirely. Because if he's jamming anything from pocket nines plus, from maybe like ace 10 off or something, then he's probably not a great target to 4-bet bluff, just because he's jamming so wide. I do, however, think the most likely scenario is that he has a hand like pocket kings or pocket aces, and he assumes that I'm never folding after I 4-bet, and so he just jams the money in. Table 2, King 10 suited. This player completes, and I think his stack is just about deep enough for me to put in a small value raise here. I think he is completing quite wide. He has 50% VPIP so far. Therefore, I think King X, King High is ahead of his range a decent amount, ahead of his hand a decent amount of the time. We do flop second pair on a drawy board and he min bets into us. I think this is a good spot for a value raise. We can definitely get called by worse here, maybe some flush draws, a hand like 7-8 or 9-10. So I decide to put in a raise for value and protection. That way I also protect my hand against things like random overcards. Table 2, just going to be folding the 10-5. And I think I did try and make a conscious effort at this point to play slightly tighter. Especially since so far my stats are quite loose. But a lot of the fact that, for example, on table 2 I've been playing 42-32 over 73 hands. But then a lot of this, while it may seem as if I'm playing extremely loose, it's just that I'm exploiting some very tight players in some particular situations. For example, opening any 2 against the player in the big blind who is playing far too tight. And the same goes on table 1 where I'm playing 32-26 over 58 hands. I'm not necessarily playing ridiculously loose, it's just that my VPIP and PFR stats are going to be higher when there are some very tight players on the table. Table 1, I do decide to flat the ace-8 suited. It's not necessarily a standard call in the big blind versus a button open. I do think I have some good implied odds, not because this player is bad, but because this player is irregular and is possibly quite aggressive. Therefore, if I do hit something good, then perhaps he may attempt to barrel some streets as a bluff even. And table 1, if it's folded to me with the queen 5, I'm just going to steal from the big blind. The button does open raise, and the button has been stealing 40% of the time so far. So he is a good target perhaps for 3-bet bluffs, although It's always better to have a slightly better hand than Queen 5 offsuit. This doesn't necessarily mean that 3-betting a hand like Queen 5 offsuit against a right player is not going to be profitable. It just means that it's probably going to be more profitable with a hand like Queen 9 suited, because you have more potential and you will make a strong hand slightly more often, even though you were bluffing pre-flop. And not even necessarily make a hand, you are going to have more barreling opportunities when you turn draws. And table 1, against these very tight blinds, I'm just going to open the 4-2 suited. It's probably fine to open any 2 suited cards against most blinds. It really all depends on your ability to play post-flop. Table 2, I don't see much point in raising, and we are definitely getting the odds to call with that open-ender, and the same applies on the turn. And we do hit on the river, and it's just a case of how much do we think this player will call, and some of the time he may even have a 2-pair type hand on this particular board texture. But given the fact that there is one card to a straight out there, he may not call that much. So I make it just over what's in the pot. Table 1 is a standard open raise with the ace-king offsuit. And table 1, we get into an interesting situation because we have been saying all through the video how tight this player is, who is playing 14-11, and he then decides to 3-bet bluff us in a spot where it's not standard to 3-bet bluff. So not only do we think he's never bluffing, but he's also 3-betting in a spot where it's either not a good idea to bluff or people never bluff. And against a lot of players you can make some pretty tight folds in this particular situation. I'm certainly not thrilled about having ace-king in this particular situation. I do think folding is fine. The problem is you will see players with a tendency that when they look down at ace-king, they think that it's standard to 4-bet call ace-king at pretty much any spot on the table, when if I were to 4-bet ace-king offsuit in this particular spot, when I get 3-bet by the player in the cutoff versus my MP3 open, if I were to 4-bet ace-king, 4-bet call ace-king in this spot, this would actually be a pretty big spew in my opinion. However, in other situations, for example, you have ace-king on the button and you are 3-bet by the blinds. If the correct dynamic has been established, then it is going to be often pretty standard to 4-bet call with ace-king offsuit. The positions involved when the action occurs are crucial in deciding whether it's a good spot to get all in with your hand, and generally in early position battles, a hand like ace-king is often going to come off as an underdog. Even if it's against a hand like pocket queens, you are still going to be a slight underdog. And when those players turn up with a hand like pocket kings or pocket aces, which they can legitimately be 3-betting against your MP opening range, then you are obviously going to be in very bad shape. But some players will still insist on 4-bet calling ace-king in this spot, and then saying it's a cooler when villain shows up with pocket kings and pocket aces. Against a huge proportion of villains, it is not a cooler. It is almost, I would go so far as to say, a standard fold at the Microstakes. Even calling out of position is not going to be a good idea, because when you do hit your hand, you are often going to end up dominated. For example, even if you hit your king, you're either going to be against something like pocket queens and maybe not get any action, or you are going to be against a hand like pocket aces and you are still going to lose your stack post flop. It makes sense overall to just fold these hands. Table 3 is another interesting situation. Under the gun, who is reasonably tight, open raises, and the flop is a king 5-5. And these are in actual fact pretty good flops to float out of position. And this also is the case if you have no hand whatsoever. And the reason is that people don't expect you to float these flops out of position, especially with air, because out of position floats just happen a lot less frequently. So when the board is a king high dry board and you call out of position, villain immediately assumes that you are going to have a king or something very strong, and it's very unlikely villain is going to continue barreling with pretty much any of his range. And this either means that you can see a very cheap showdown. So for example, in this case, I can check call the pocket eights out of position because I'm pretty convinced villain is not going to be firing the turn with any hand that is not a king X, and quite possibly the same goes for the river. He's just not going to be firing the river because he expects me to have a king or strong showdown value so much of the time. And in the case that you have a bluff, since you can represent showdown value so strongly by floating out of position, at least against perceptive opponents, and I suspect that this guy involved in this hand is a regular and perhaps thinks a little bit more deeply about hands than a fish might, then he is also going to give me credit when I then fire the river as a bluff. In this case, there is no need to fire the river as a bluff since I do have pretty good showdown value. I was just able to call this on the flop without too much fear of villain ever barreling me off on the turn with a bluff. And villain does end up having the ace jack. And I think it's unlikely that even if I had a bluff, that villain is going to be making an ace high call on that river. Table 1, we're against this player who bluffed, 5-bet bluff jammed on me earlier. Or sorry, I mean 5-bet jammed. Whether it's a bluff or not, I don't know. But he's somewhat sending me the message that he knows how to play the 3-bet, 4-bet, 5-bet game in inverted commas. So I'm going to exploit that by bluffing against him in a situation where I'm pretty much never bluffing. And that's because he open raises under the gun, and if I expect his under the gun opening range to be very tight, my 3-betting range against his under the gun open is literally going to be aces, kings, and probably not much else. Therefore, I expect to get a lot of credit in this situation. I don't think this player ever is going to give me credit for bluffing against his under the gun opening range, just because people don't do it that frequently at the micros. When you get into small stakes and perhaps higher stakes games, it's more frequent for people to 3-bet bluff against under the gun ranges because more players are thinking on that level. But at the micros, if you find yourself playing against a thinking regular, then you can often quite successfully 3-bet bluff against the under the gun and middle position opens, just because it looks so strong. Whereas ironically, you then end up having more trouble 3-bet bluffing them in the situations where it's standard to 3-bet bluff. For example, a good regular opens on the button and you are in the blinds and decide to 3-bet bluff. They are going to give you way less credit because they expect you to be 3-bet bluffing in that spot because it's a standard spot to 3-bet bluff, because perhaps if you're both regulars, they know that their open range from the button is going to be light and that you're therefore going to be 3-betting that opening range light. So therefore villain is going to play back at a much higher frequency. But when you do think that someone perhaps has a grasp of the different ranges involved in playing the 3-bet, 4-bet game, you can then start to exploit them in other ways by bluffing in situations where they never expect you to be bluffing, such as 3-bet bluffing against an under the gun opening range or MP opening range. But if this player is not a thinking regular and is a fish, then it doesn't really make much sense to bluff against the stronger part of their opening range, for example their middle position opening range or their under the gun opening range, because that range is just going to be stronger in general. So your 3-bet bluff is not going to work as frequently. In fact, your 3-bet bluff is going to work much more frequently against the parts of their opening range that are typically wider, for example their cutoff opening range or their button opening range. So just something to bear in mind about the positions involved in 3-bet bluffing, and a lot of this is covered in the video that should be released shortly. Table 1, the ace queen offsuit. It's a pretty standard open raise, especially given how tight these players in the blinds have been playing. Table 1, I just decide to fold the 8-9 offsuit. It may in fact be profitable to call here. We're getting a good price to call. We're in position. The stacks are slightly above 100 big blinds. It's definitely fine just to fold your offsuit connectors as well. Another thing is we aren't too worried about players behind us also calling or making squeeze attempts, just because those players are so tight. And again, for this reason, I just open the 10-7 suited from mid position. Definitely not a standard open raise. Even if I'm playing loose aggressive, I usually won't open raise this hand from mid position. But both players in position on me are so tight that I think it is going to be profitable. So we can see on table 4 that at some point some short stackers have joined the table, and again this is the kind of stage where I will probably be leaving the table. I don't like to play against short stackers, not because it's unprofitable to play against short stackers, it's just that I think I can turn a more consistent profit against people with full stacks. There is a lot of variance involved against playing short stacks. For example, on table 4, I'm 3-bet by this guy who's just got to the table, and he 3-bets me, and I'm pretty sure with 25 big blinds it's pretty standard for me to jam over the top. And he does end up having ace queen, so I do get the money in, a very slight favourite, and he gets there. And this is part of the variance involved in playing short stacks. You have to get the money in a lot more frequently, so whether you win or lose is dependent on the cards rather than just perhaps your skill. And table 2, I just end up folding the suited ace, partly because the small blind is short stacked. If both players had a full stack, I would probably be continuing with the suited ace. And table 1, I'm just going to open raise a king 10 suited, and I'm just going to complete the orbits on these tables and then probably call it a session. So hopefully throughout the series we can mix it up a bit. I hope to include some more session reviews, some live sessions, some hand history reviews, perhaps 1 or 2 leak finders of submitted videos. So if there's anything you'd like to see, also in terms of theory videos and any of the kind of concepts you'd like me to discuss, feel free to post in the forums somewhere or on my blog. Table 1, I just flat the ace queen suited. I don't 3-bet for value that often against an MP open. I tend to flat a lot of my value range, at least against certain players, just because, as discussed, 3-betting does typically look very strong. And on this ace 3-3 board, there usually isn't much point raising. The only thing that might continue that's worse is a flush draw, but this is a very small part of villain's range. The plan is definitely to check call down. And in this particular spot, it seems to me that villain's range is so weak that I'm actually going to check behind the turn and then go for a small value bet on the river. And this way I can hopefully get looked up by something like pocket tens, pocket eights, pocket jacks, that kind of hand. Whereas I think he might possibly be folding these on the turn if I bet directly on the turn. And I think he does end up having pocket tens, so it worked out that way. And the size of the river bet is quite important also. I think maybe if I bet pot, he is not necessarily calling with the pocket tens, although he still might do, but I prefer to bet smaller. So yeah, let me know if there's anything you'd like to see in the videos, and I think you can comment perhaps to ask any questions about some of the hands. If you'd like to know more information about why I made certain plays, then feel free to ask. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video. This has been Weasel for iPoker VIP.